we already did that. Next slide. Okay, so a lot of new diseases that we're dealing with in the U.S. globally are all, I mean, you've heard of them. They're diseases, they're called zoonotic diseases. All that really is a fancy word for diseases that can pass from animals to humans and back and forth.
2 to 3 years.
Listeria, which caused the deadliest food safety outbreak in history last year with the cantaloupes in Colorado, was non-existent and not on the radar 20 years ago, and is a livestock origin pathogen. E. coli 0157H7 is this completely new, completely differently virulent, differently toxic to people strain of E. coli. And it, again, was something that didn't exist 15, 20 years ago and now is highly, highly prevalent and not just in the food system. But that's where it has all of its origins. And all your swine flus and your bird flus and the things that cause all of these endemics and pandemics worldwide now, all of these trace their origins back to the food system and essentially more directly to the way that we produce livestock. And that has everything to do with keeping massive numbers of animals housed together in closely confined quarters with tons of their waste.
Right.
It's no mystery, and anybody with a big sense of biology can tell you that that's how this happens. But we've taken it one step much further and much worse than that, and we've given rise to these whole new strains and species of bacterial pathogens that resist all and many, if not all, of the drugs that we have as therapeutic medicine for those. So if we could advance the slide, please. Superbugs. These are bacteria. They don't have to be pathogens, meaning they don't have to be harmful to people to be considered a superbug. It's any bacteria that can resist at least one class of antibiotics. We've seen drug-resistant strains of E. coli, which is, one of the most common foodborne pathogens, of Staphylococcus, which is a staph infection.
Right.
Somebody may have heard of MRSA, which is methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. There are a lot of strains, the newest strains of MRSA, and tend to trace their origins back to livestock, and they're genetically distinct from, say, the hospital MRSA, which was the sort of first one that came out. And Neisseria gonorrhea. Any guesses what that is?
Tell us.
Yeah, I think you could probably guess. That they've just found, and again, that's not a livestock pathogen per se, but they found strains of gonorrhea now that literally cannot be treated with antibiotics.
Okay, is that why we're getting MRSA? I've had.
I will get. There are
because
some
my
really,
husband and I both have had 3 bouts with it, or we've had to be hospitalized, operated on, everything.
Do you work with livestock?
I live
or do you
near
live proximate
a farm.
to?
I'm right next to a farm with livestock, and he's got 5,000 acres right beside me. He's got livestock, and plus I was out there with this dumping.
Sure.
Okay, and this guy not only just dumped fracking, he had a portage on business, and he literally he would go down the road and open the valves, and it went into our water system. And after he did that, we never even heard of MRSA.
Yeah.
And now we've been affected, and scarred us, and it's terrible. It's the worst thing I've ever went through.
My 20-year-old cousin almost lost his foot just a couple of years ago, and that was not a lot. So I will get more into that. The total number that can be sort of attributed to the livestock and to the proximity to a CAFO, proximity to these dense concentrated areas of livestock and drug use. In that livestock is a huge risk factor for acquiring one of these infections. So most definitely that can play a huge role.
Okay.
And we've seen just so many other bacteria, and some which are harmful, some which are not harmful, and that'll be the importance of that will become apparent a little bit later. But so many are passing around these genes now that confer all these different types of resistance to all these different therapeutic medicines that are the arsenal of treatment options that we have for treating these types of infections or treating this type of disease. Okay, so how does this happen? It really happens in 2 different ways, one of which is just your classical natural selection, in which resistance is conferred by a favorable genetic mutation, usually something that just happens randomly, like all mutations happen in sort of natural evolution things. But what are we really driving this with? On these farms, we use so many of the total number of antibiotics that we use in this country. By a lot of counts, it's something in the neighborhood of 80% of the antibiotics used in the US go into animals. And that's not veterinary medicine for the most part. It's prophylactic, meaning that it's preventative for like these completely filthy environments that obviously are rife with disease. Yeah, you saturate it in penicillin, you saturate it in tetracycline, you will bring down the numbers of bugs. But what you do is you create an environment that's just saturated in drugs and drug residues that kill off bugs, which it can kill off, and then leaves no competition whatsoever for the bacteria which are resistant to certain types of drugs. So you create an environment that just selects over and over and over and over and over again for the worst types of pathogenic bacteria, for the ones that are more and more resistant to our modern therapies. And these are the exact same thing. There are a handful of antibiotics that have said, this is reserved for human clinical medicine, you can't use this in animals, but it's a handful. And I'll get a bit more into this in a bit, but shockingly enough, you sometimes see bugs that are resistant to even those banned drugs. There's a couple of competing reasons for why that might be. But essentially, we just create a situation where it's survival of the fittest. You get the resistant bugs proliferating while you kill off their competition, because it's always about the game of, who can maximize resource and how can beat the competitor. So that's this sort of classic way in which bacteria, through the traditional vertical evolution, passing on of favorable traits and greater amounts of surviving populations that have favorable traits. Bacteria have a whole separate game that they play that's off limits to we higher species, but it's called horizontal gene transfer, and this was pretty much the most jaw-dropping thing I learned in grad school so far. So, horizontal gene transfer. This is pretty much the opposite of your classic old-time evolution of grandma had a favorable trait that she passed on to her daughters, and their family tends to live longer or have more babies than people without that trait. Bacteria are already much better at that classical evolution because they can reproduce in 20 minutes. And if you can go through a reproductive cycle in 20 minutes, you have a lot better chance of those random favorable mutations showing up. And then that's the game they play. But they can do something entirely separate from that, which is they can actually take a gene that shows up randomly in their genome, and break it off as they're reproducing and just sort of pass it to a different bug altogether. Now that can mean an E. coli, one strain of E. coli is passing it to another strain of E. coli, and then where you first had one resistant strain, now you're dealing with 4. But it gets even worse than that. E. coli can pass it to staph, staph can pass it to enterococcus, enterococcus can pass it to salmonella and back. And it goes between the harmful bacteria, the bacteria that end up in humans, the bacteria that are just on animals, to create a sort of microbial environment where you have like a bank of genes that you're all confer different types of resistance, and it builds over time until the resistance becomes more widespread, and instead of being resistant to 2 classes of antibiotics, they're resistant to 5 or all of them. And that's the kind of arms race that we're engaged in, and we can't win that. If you can do that, pass a favorable gene to a whole other species without even killing an individual bacteria in the process, we will always be playing catch up to that process. So can we go one more slide forward? So where is this a problem? Where isn't this a problem? It's at every stage of the food supply chain, from the farms to the processors, which I believe is a really critical stage, from it going to, this one cow out of the herd, or 10% of this herd is infected, to by the time you get to the far end of the slaughterhouse, it's a low-level amount of contamination on 90% of the products coming out of there. But it doesn't stop there. It goes into the distribution networks, and it goes directly into consumers who are exposed through their food products directly, but also indirectly in so many different ways. One of the populations that is the most harmed by this phenomenon are workers who work in the food supply chain at pretty much any level. The worst off are slaughterhouse workers. they have some of the highest rates of occupational injury and infection than, I mean, it's 5 to 7 times the national average in a swine plant for occupational infections than it is for the national average. And they, I mean, you have occupational illness, but then these workers bring these bugs home. They bring them and spread them around their communities, where if they go get sick and end up in the hospital, it ends up in the local healthcare systems. These are tenacious, tenacious bugs that have learned to survive in the harshest of environments. So when they do not just stay in the animal, they tend to become incredibly prevalent in so many different environments. The ecological environment, I mean, we found it in beach sand, in sludge, in drinking water, in reservoirs, in soil. It's incredible stuff. They can survive in so many different environments. And most recently, just the other day, I saw that they trapped crows and found it in crows and shorebirds. They found MRSA just on these animals that are now kind of just migrating through that environment. But that brings the possibility of that bacteria migrating to a whole new niche that it can occupy. Homes and hospitals tend to be some of the most important places for people who don't have direct contact with livestock to end up being exposed to some of those illnesses, because worker who was sick or farmer's kid who got sick ends up in the hospital or ends up at school, and it tends to just spread to all sorts of people who, you know, often the estimate is that 1 out of 3 people with MRSA are carrying around something in their nasal passages or on their skin that is positive. You're not sick because you're healthy and you can keep that at your sort of body's boundary, but you bring that with you where you go. You're touching doorknobs, you're touching shared surfaces, you're touching your kids or anything like that. Eventually, it finds its way to someone who is young or very old or immunocompromised or sick already, and they tend to be the ones who actually fall ill, actually go to the hospital, actually die. And it's no small problem, and it's not self-contained either.
Well, they told me that once you have MRSA, that's it. You have it. You will keep it. You might not get another outbreak for 2 or 3 years. Well, mine happened a month later. You know, I was sick again.
It's highly, highly variable. If you've been infected once,
you're infected. It's in there. They told me, the doctors said.
It's yeah. I mean, oftentimes that there are some people who seem to truly clear it. It's a minority. It's a minority of cases.
Trust me.
And you're at a much higher risk of reinfection for the rest of your life.
As a healthcare worker, I mean, I'm around it, but before my last back surgery, I tested positive for MRSA of the NERS.
Yep.
And had used an antibiotic and all of that prior.
You were colonized, though, not infected? And
no,
just
it was just colonized.
Right.
Yeah. But I had to be treated before they would operate on me with an antibiotic that I just had to put in my nose. And,
just a topical.
And I also had to gargle. So.
Yeah, I mean, these hospitals are getting, especially in a lot of rural areas, they've set up screening programs. Hershey, PA has the Hershey Hospital has a screening program where they screen every single person coming into that hospital
I
at
think
entrance.
they were afraid if they didn't treat it or do something that I could end up with it in my spine.
And certainly, I mean, there's your health to consider, and then there's the fact that you work in a healthcare setting, and you know, there are so many sick people coming through there. There are so many families of sick people coming through there. It's one of the most important places for people to pick up these kind of like secondary infections. Like, they're not directly being exposed to the point of origin of the disease, but it ends up there, and it's just this stuff hangs on. It's incredibly hardy.
They claim that most healthcare workers now will test positive for having been exposed.
And again, there's a correlation between being colonized in your nose, say, or on your skin, and actually getting an infection. But it's more of a risk factor for where are you going to be a vector for that to end up? How will you transmit that bug from the healthcare setting into your home or into one of some place that's within your social network? The sort of environmental.
But being colonized is.
I've come up positive.
Being colonized, you can't get it from.
You sure can.
Being colonized.
But by some counts, a almost a half of people walking around are colonized.
Right.
So it's highly, highly prevalent, and it's getting to the point where it's not just the sick, old, immunocompromised, or very young who are actually falling ill. There's athletes, young student athletes are one of the highest risk groups just because they spend a lot of time in locker rooms.
You try to tell people when they take an antibiotic to finish it, and they don't. I mean, that's causing so much of a problem.
It really is. I mean, the misuse, overuse of antibiotics is the driver for this. There's no question whatsoever. The problem is, there are many, many, many thorny issues with that, but one area where it's really clear that we don't need to be, we could change our practices change a lot about the actual use of drugs in this country would be in livestock, because there's veterinary medicine, but most large animal vets don't want willy-nilly application through feed, a totally unregulated concentration, amount, type of drug, because that changes the effectiveness of actually needing them therapeutically, of needing to treat a real infection, in animals and in humans too.
In the best interest of time, if everyone could please refrain from questions just right now. I see hands going up. Just because we have speakers, we kind of waited because of the weather. People were coming in late, and Patrick will be here afterwards. We're going to have a 45 minutes, so everyone will have time to have their question, but I just want to make sure that everyone gets their opportunity. So please.
I also always get a ton of questions when I give a presentation like this, so I made this presentation actually very short in the interest of taking questions. The question is always, how big of a problem is this in the world of drug resistance? What is the real contribution of the way that we produce and process livestock and the drug use within livestock? The answer is we don't really know, because none of the really big research organizations that fund and drive research in this country have considered this a worthy enough problem. In the Netherlands, where the government takes this much, much, much more seriously and has a really amazing surveillance program set up, they've estimated that about 25% of all the MRSA cases, 25% of all resistant E. coli infections have their origins in livestock. And they're pretty darn certain about that, because if you genetically type these things, they have a very distinct signature that says, this came from a hospital, this came from livestock, this is from the community. In the US, we have not done that type of comprehensive research. We have a much bigger food system to have surveillance over, but we're also a much more moneyed country than are the Netherlands, so it depends where you want to place your priorities. In the US, antibiotic resistance costs about $20 billion a year in extra healthcare costs, and $35 million in societal costs, about 8 million additional days spent in the hospital for every year for people just in this country. Again, not all of those are attributable to industrial food animal production practices, but based on the Netherlands, I'd say you could say about a quarter of them are. But again, we have not done that research here. It could be a different picture. But based on what's out there, I would say you can attribute about a quarter of it to it, give or take. A friend of mine did a market basket study, which is just where you go out and go to the grocery store and buy stuff and grow what you can grow off of it. He bought mainly ground beef and chicken, all from the supermarket, and about 50% of it came up positive for Staph aureus, and about 50% of that was multi-drug resistance. So doing the math on that, that means a quarter of all those meat products had multi-drug resistance, Staph, on them. That's not a low prevalence, that's a high prevalence. And that's only one of many really important ways in which a human being can be exposed, but that's a darn direct one. And we have not studied this, we have not placed any emphasis on that as a potential way that people in this country are getting sick, really sick. Just go one more forward. So this sounds like a really system-wide awful problem, and it is. What can we do about it? I mean, on the policy level, we need to stop the prophylactic and the use of antibiotics as a prophylactic to bring down these background levels of disease, and as a growth promoter, because that's the other reason they administer it through the feed. They claim, I've read a lot that says it doesn't do much, but maybe about 1 or 2 days, it kills off your gut bacteria. The same thing will happen to people if you take a lot of antibiotics. antibiotics, but it kills off your gut bacteria, which essentially slows your metabolism down. You store more fat, you gain weight, and the bird or the pig or the cow reaches market weight just a day or two faster. So there's pennies saved per head, per chicken, per whatever. And that has been for 50 years how they've justified, that's been the main justification for feed antibiotics in livestock. That needs to stop. We're never going to stop. I mean, this is, all the trends are in all of the wrong directions with this, and we're never going to stop that before we remove the driving force behind it, which is where 80% of our antibiotics go to in this country every year, which is into animals, and mostly really unnecessarily. We need much better monitoring and reporting of where these drugs are used, how much is used. I mean, there's no good data on this, and it's a huge problem for research, because if you want to look at Iowa and you know exactly what types of drugs were used in what concentration, and you see, this hospital in Des Moines has MRSA, which is resistant to all of these livestock drugs, and they're all, it's an area surrounded by livestock production, that's a really clear, convincing case, and they've left it kind of ill-defined so that nobody can make a clear, convincing case about the correlation between these practices and these superbugs. But fundamentally, you can't raise animals in an environment like that and not expect a huge amount of your herd to die off and you'd go out of business if you raise animals in confinement like that with those practices. So, really, you need prophylactic antibiotics oral, or you'll lose an unacceptable level of your stock. That has to stop. I mean, I don't think that justifies the use of prophylactic antibiotics, but I do think it indicates why we're stuck in this position. There's a lot more that needs to change than just drug use practices. There needs to be a real system-wide reimagining of a system where we don't need to use drugs, where we can let healthy animals that are not a monoculture of just one type of Cornish cross hen or one type of pig, to allow that genetic diversity and that sort of, that is the greatest weapon you could ever have against a rampant bacterial infection, is genetic diversity within a population. That'll take you a lot further than overusing amoxicillin will for decades. So, that is all a bunch of bad news. I'm sorry.
I love that.
But some interesting things are changing, but it's really still this deeply entrenched system where a lot of money, not just from industrial food, but pharmaceutical companies more than anybody else actually have a whole lot invested in maintaining things such as they are. And that is hugely problematic because it's a giant roadblock to any meaningful change or reform we could put in place to change the system and stop some of these trends.